Dr. Swaine, welcome to CCTV News.
Thank you.
You have some specific proposals about what the Western Hemisphere should be like with the balance of power. Tell us about your blueprint.
Well, I think the United States and China are moving towards a balance of power in reality already in the region. That is, China's capabilities, economic, military, are growing relative to the United States. In the past, the U.S. had a more dominant position in the maritime area, in the oceans. It's becoming more equal now. So I'm saying that there needs to be a deliberate effort to establish a stable balance of power, not an unstable balance of power. And to do that, I think the U.S. and China have to agree on a certain set of conditions.
Before we go to a certain set of conditions, let's talk about the equal, the adjective you use. What exactly are you referring to?
What I'm referring to is a combination of two things. One, the economic power of the two countries in the region. China's economic strength in the region has obviously grown in very significant ways in the last 30 years under the reforms. The United States is still a major economic power in the region, but relative to China, its strength economically, I think, has diminished. It doesn't have quite the leverage, quite the influence in trade, investment in the area than the Chinese do. The Chinese are way behind on the investment side, but on the trade side, they're not.
So that's the economy.
That's the economic. And the other side of it is the military, both military and paramilitary, if you will, Coast Guard and that sort of thing. China has increased its strength both in its Air Force and its Navy in significant ways, particularly along its coastline. And the United States has also to some degree increased, but not all that much. And it's not going to be able to spend that much more to stay ahead of China in the future. So the Chinese military and Coast Guard is going to really establish parity with the US and with Japan over the next 20 years or so. So I'm talking about long-term trends here. I'm not talking about the here and now. I'm talking about what's going to happen over the next 20, 25 years.
Then tell us about this balance. How is that likely to be?
Well, I think the first thing has to be a recognition in the countries involved, China, the US, Japan, and others, that this balance is in fact emerging. Some don't even believe that that's what's happening. Some think that China's economy is going to decline, China will not continue to grow, etc. So first thing has to recognize the problem. Second thing has to recognize that you've got to do more than just what's called muddling through, just sort of dealing with each individual problem as it occurs in a kind of piecemeal way. You've got to have a broader strategy for establishing a balance. What that means is the two militaries have to adopt a more defensive posture towards each other. That's one thing. Secondly, they have to reach certain very specific understandings about these hotspot issues in the Western Pacific, from Korea all the way down to the South China Sea. That's going to take time. This is not something that can happen overnight. It can't happen like a grand bargain, as it's said. It has to happen incrementally through a process of trial and error and feeling the way along.
Michael, let's take a look at some of the words you have just used. Defensive militaries for China and the United States. Is that really likely to happen, given the fact that the U.S. still considers itself playing an extremely important role in the Asia-Pacific region? And China embraced that. However, there probably is different planning about the future.
Yes, I think that's very true. The U.S. military has long held a military doctrine, military belief that is offensively oriented, overseas power and projecting power in a way that you act early and you seize the initiative, you win. In the Western Pacific, I think there's going to have to be a transition to a posture that is less oriented towards controlling and more oriented towards denying the other side some kind of area that you wouldn't want it to have. So you have to have a more defensive-oriented posture. It doesn't mean that you remove your military from the area. It just means you change the posture of it.
Give me some examples. What can happen with the U.S. military, for example?
The example would be that you put more emphasis on the ground defense of territory, Japanese home islands, and also on submarine type of capabilities as opposed to aircraft carriers and forward deployed destroyers. You have a relatively smaller number that are balanced against each other, and you have them in a doctrine that is not escalatory. In other words, you don't immediately try to seize the initiative and take the fight to the other side. You don't, for example, in a real serious crisis over Taiwan, You don't attack the Chinese mainland, and China does not attack the United States. You really focus on dealing with each other's military capabilities in the area, denying them the ability to succeed. So you have a balance of defensive forces in that way.
But any of those examples you have just raised keep my heart bouncing very fast. For example, the conflict of Taiwan. What do you make of these some very real and strategic issues in the Asia-Pacific region? You've got the DPRK issue, you've got South China Sea just recently popping up. You also got Taiwan, Japan, all of these issues. They are intertwined. They have a lot to do with the recent interactions. Also, they will cast their shadows about the future development.
Oh, sure.
What do you make of these recent phenomena, their impact on the overall planning and the strategic thinking?
Well, I think all of these issues are really key to establishing a stable balance. Right now, you point to each of these as being the only real source of real confrontation between the US and China. Over Korea, I doubt very much the US and China would actually have conflict over Korea, but you could have a very messy situation there that could lead to the two countries taking actions that the other regard as threatening, and they could then escalate their positions. You want to avoid getting into that situation. The US and China need to talk very seriously about future contingencies. What if certain things happen? How do you respond? How would we respond? There has to be an understanding about that.
Do we have experiences earlier about this?
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, do countries have any previous experience about this?
Sure.
Give us examples.
Well, you can have, in the past, you've had understandings that have been reached between major powers about exercising a certain amount of restraint in dealing, for example, between the US and the Soviet Union. They had certain kinds of confidence building measures where they would indicate that they would not do certain things. If there was a crisis of some kind, they would not alert certain forces. They would not do certain other things. So you have a history of precedent where countries can talk to each other to try and reassure each other. It's not just something you do on your own and expect the other side is going to do their own thing.
But several things. One is China, of course, is not comparable to Soviet Union, early Soviet Union, when it comes to its relations with the United States. That's one point. Secondly, Cold War lasted for a long time. So you really got a lot of time capital in order to invest into all of these negotiations and code of conducts and rules. And now China rises, the US certainly responded. These things happen very fast. So the thing you have proposed, is it possible, once again, given the fast-paced changes happening all the time?
Yes, I think it is possible, but it's not going to happen overnight. I don't think we are in such a dire situation in the relationship today that you must have all of this happen in the next year, 2 years, even 5 years. It's going to be a long process. It's going to be gradual. But you have to have a deliberate decision made by the countries involved that they're going to seek this kind of balance. If they don't do that, if they just assume that the two sides will establish a natural balance, I think it will be unstable because each side will test the other.
Exactly.
Its relative capabilities. And if you don't have a sense of really concrete reassurance, limits on deployments, limits in policy terms. For example, you have to talk about the long-term future of Korea. What is the future of the Korean Peninsula long-term? I think it's going to be a unified peninsula and one that is going to be not entirely without any sort of alliance with the United States. It will lean towards the US, but you won't have any US forces on the Korean Peninsula.
A lot of scenarios over there, but one of the things, Michael, is important is who is likely to act first? You talk about defensive, make the militaries. So will the Chinese do that first, or will the US do that first? Or are they going to establish a mechanism in which they can both monitor the others to follow the steps?
Right. Well, the whole point is you don't want one side or the other to act first, particularly in a military way. You want to make sure that the two sides don't look at a problem like Korea and say, we have to use our military to establish our position or to defend our position. You've got to be able to have an environment where the two sides feel reassured that you're not going to result in that kind of situation. So that requires understanding. You can't do it indirectly by just assuming the other side will restrain themselves. You have to understand limits.
So defensive, what are the other proposals that you are having toward a better future, as you said, balance of power?
Well, one other proposal is that the region has to become even more integrated economically. So
haven't they already?
no, it's not nearly as far as it should be.
Tell us more.
It needs to have ultimately an Asia-Pacific free trade area. We don't have that today. We have individual bilateral free trade arrangements. We have some more ambitious notions like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Program, but these are still...
The former has some legal issues, the latter, of course, in the process. We don't know yet.
Exactly. And I'm saying there has to be a more deliberate effort to try and make that process not only develop, but the US and China converge in it. They both have to be members of these kinds of multi-nation economic organizations. China needs to be a member of TPP. The US, of course, will be a member of it, but you have to get there gradually. And that's going to take some time.
If
it's
we could
not
have
going to
TPP.
be... Yes.
If we could have, that's
well,
a precondition.
The major problem of that right now is the United States.
It's in Washington right
it
now.
Is in
Yeah,
Washington.
you know that better than I do. But, you know, talking about all of this, Michael, you seem to suggest that countries and politics are being run in an orderly way. But it's not.
Yes.
Dr. Swaine, it's not. So what's going to happen? What about that proposal under the current circumstances?
Under the current circumstances, I think it's very difficult to actually get this kind of a comprehensive assessment and strategic thinking. First, you have to be able to stabilize to some greater degree the hotspots. South China Sea is the most important. Right now, there needs to be understanding between the United States and China about the limits on military operations. Yeah. Both sides need to put things on the table. They have to reach a deliberate understanding about limits in this area. They haven't done that. And so that is the first step that needs to happen. I think there needs to be something similar to that regarding the Taiwan Strait. I am a believer in the fact the United States and China need to talk to each other about limiting their defensive deployments and their military assistance across the Taiwan Strait. They haven't done that. It's a very hard thing to do, but I think ultimately it's going to have to be done.
You see the rise of nationalism, the rise of populism in your country's politics, in many other countries as well. At this stage, is strategic thinking still possible?
I think so. I definitely think so.
What does it take?
What I think it takes is a leadership, not just in the United States, but also in China, that takes the long-term view and takes a view of really seriously talking to the other side, interacting with the other side, and telling the population of what the interests are in doing that. You have to communicate with your own public in a better way. I think the Chinese government doesn't do a good job of that personally in its own domestic situation. It plays too much to an extreme form of nationalism, which I think is not healthy. I think the United States, by its same token, is too resistant now to like trade deals and accommodation or reconciliation on some issues with China. Right now in the United States, if you talk about some kind of mutual recognition or mutual accommodation, people don't support that notion. They think it means that you're appeasing China, and you're not appeasing China. This has to be done from a position of strength.
Final question for you, Dr. Swaine, also briefly from you. You are one of those who knows China very well. But forgive me if I to say so. Many of you now in Washington are not popular because they would regard you as too close to China to have a fair judgment about the U.S. future. What would you say?
Well, I would say that people have to stop labeling people. They have to stop just calling a person pro-China, anti-China. I think that happens in China.
Not black and white.
Many Chinese people look at somebody like myself, my colleagues, and they'll say, oh, he's either a friend of China or he's not a friend of China. We have an interest in a cooperative relationship. And that involves doing things that are serving the interests of both countries. And if that is called being too pro-China, then I guess I'm too pro-China.
Dr. Swaine, thank you so much for being with us. All the best to your blueprint. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.